Welcome everyone to our August double study day. Hope everyone's going well and ready for a good afternoon and evening together. To start off our afternoon, we will be singing hymn 110. You do have to keep your masks on, however. It can be a bit hard to sing with a mask, but that's all right. So hymn 110 followed by prayer. Let's pray. Our Father in the highest of heavens above, we come to you now so grateful that we can all meet in one place, as we know we are very blessed in this country. Please watch over us today and help all our actions and conversations give glory to you and your Son, as we try to be better disciples before you. We especially now remember those in Afghanistan who are under immense pressure and trial right now. Many have lost their lives. Please be with the widows and their children that have managed, by your grace, to flee to Pakistan, and be with the brothers and sisters who were dragged from their homes last week because of their belief in you. It is often so easy for us to feel removed from the situation, as it is so physically far from us, and we live in a peaceful and prosperous country. But help us to continue in prayer constantly for the Ecclesial worldwide and the young people who can't meet like we do for fear of their lives. Please be with all our young people here in Adelaide. Help us to become more united as your Son's return comes closer. We have such a large youth group, which is such a blessing. We are all different, but we all come here with the same goal of strengthening our relationship with you. Some aren't here today because of health, or because they're struggling with their faith, or because of loneliness. Help us to remember them and to reach out to them and to wrap our arms around them and show care to them. We most of all pray for the return of your Son back to this earth so he can set up your kingdom where there will be peace forever and we can spend eternity with you. It is in his name we pray, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. For our first study today, we have Brother Brad Mitsos speaking to the topic, The Astonishing Rise of Greece. And to introduce that, Sam Hord will read Daniel 8 for us, and if you could come up straight afterwards, that'd be great.
Reading with you all, Daniel chapter 8. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high. But one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practised and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgressions of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass, when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, A king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and he shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore, shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward, I rose up and did the king's business. And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming out and the invitation to be with you all today. Perhaps to begin, if I could, I'd like to turn to Daniel chapter 7, verse 28. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, and forgive me for substituting my name with that of Daniel there, but we read, I, Brad, was terrified by my thoughts, and my face was pale with fear. Now, that's a pretty apt description of how I'm feeling right now. My thoughts do terrify me standing up here, and my face is either pale or it's bright red, one of those two extremes. I'm deeply, deeply troubled. But like Daniel, I'm going to try to keep those thoughts to myself. Young people, it's a really, really great honour and a privilege to be with you today. And I say it's an honour and it's a privilege purely for the view and the fact of the view that I have standing up here. And as daunting as this may be, this is such a rare sight to see. That such a large group of young people from all over our city have come together on a Saturday afternoon. And the power of this, it shouldn't be lost on any of us here today at all. That a few hundred people, as I said, from over Adelaide have chosen to give up a Saturday afternoon, an afternoon which you could have been spending doing whatever pursuit or whatever interest you had. You might have had sporting pursuits, you could have gone shopping or hiking or whatever you're fishing, whatever your interest may be, and you've chosen to give that up and to come today with a group of your mates to study from God's Word, the Bible. And that, young people, for me standing here this afternoon is very, very powerful. It's simple, but it's very powerful. And for some of you today that have come out to Suburban and to the study day, this was perhaps a difficult decision to come out. For whatever reason or your circumstance, perhaps you feel left out, perhaps you feel a little bit like the odd one out in your group, perhaps in your friendship groups, or perhaps you're just struggling with life in general at the moment. Or you may have some hidden struggles perhaps that you're keeping to yourself and keeping hidden. So coming out might have been hard, but God is very thankful for your effort. He's very thankful for your effort. And He knows each of your highs and He knows each of your lows and the things that we're all dealing with. And He's thankful that today that you've made this choice to come to Suburban. Your friends are thankful. Your parents are thankful. And perhaps you're here because you feel like you should be here. It's the thing to do, but you're not here willingly or happily. Or perhaps you're here this afternoon questioning, is this whole Bible thing even right? Is it worth it? I'm certain that there's going to be some of you in that category as well, because I was your age once and I was definitely in that category as well. So young people, whatever our backgrounds, no matter where we are in life, no matter our personal situations, no matter our faith or our lack of faith, thank you for being here this afternoon. And as I look out on all of you, I'm reminded of God's promise to us that one day He is going to fill this earth with His glory, because He has called you and you are His future and you are His people. And that's a great calling, and it's an even greater responsibility that we all have. So when Mitch hit me up to do a Suburban talk last year, I actually thought, all right, see how we go. And I think maybe the committee got a little bit sucked into my surname in giving me this topic. Perhaps they've got the wrong Mitsos as well, I don't know. But, you know, I thought maybe when Mitch asked me the topic, it'd be a character study, or it'd be something, you know, encouraging perhaps, or something along those lines, and maybe a bit easier. But you know what? It's been a lot of fun actually looking into this topic. And I say fun because it has been. It's been very, very encouraging. And I hope I can share some of the things that I've actually learnt this afternoon with you in our discussion around this topic, the astonishing rise of Greece, taken from Daniel chapter 8. And I suppose when we look at the man Daniel, he's such an amazing character of faith, and no doubt you guys have, through your studies this year, you've come to really appreciate this. And we're introduced in the early chapters to a young person, Daniel, who always demonstrated his faith, a young person who was consistent, hard-working, diligent, a young person who was conscientious in everything that he did. Not sure what's going on my screen, sorry. Sorry, apologies. But Daniel was a man that was conscientious in every single thing that he did. And it's an attitude that each of us can learn so much from today. And with an attitude and a work ethic like Daniel had, it was inevitable that Daniel was going to go places. He was going to climb the ranks in whatever he put his hand to and in whatever field he worked in. So much so that Daniel ends up rising to second in command of the greatest kingdom to date in history at the time. A slave who rose to second in command of the greatest global power at the time. And the powerful lesson for us today as we try to demonstrate Daniel-like characteristics in our life was Daniel's consistency, and it was Daniel's faith. Through all circumstances, Daniel was consistent. And you know, it's easy to do a good job for a short period of time. That's easy. At work or at life or even in your spiritual life. It's easy to do a good job for a short period of time, but it's even harder to do a good job for a consistent long period of time. If you're like me, young people, you struggle at times with consistency because we tend at times to focus on the outcome more than the process. We focus on the outcome more than the process. We look to the end of the journey rather than embracing and enjoying the struggle of the journey. Not so much Daniel. His eyes were fixed, no doubt, on the prize at the end of his life, the end of the race, no doubt. But his feet were fixed firmly on the ground. You may be familiar with this guy, Dwayne Johnson. He summed up consistency this way. He said, "Success isn't always about greatness, it's about consistency. Consistent hard work leads to success. Greatness will come." Daniel, young people, was a 24-hour-a-day follower of Christ. No matter day or night, no matter good times or bad times or sad times, rich times or poor times, Daniel maintained a steady, consistent faith in his God. And this is a lesson that we all can take with us moving forward in our lives. And for his consistency, Daniel was rewarded in a vision. And he was rewarded with a really incredible insight that we've come to discuss this afternoon, an insight which no one else was privileged to receive in some amazing visions, and one that we want to explore together. So Daniel chapter 8, the theme of the astonishing rise of Greece. And we begin at the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1. We read, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Belteshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai." So this is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belteshazzar. Daniel was given a vision by God, a powerful vision. Verses 3 to 4, we're introduced to this vision, and we're introduced to an animal, a ram. And this animal has 2 horns. We read, "Then I lifted up mine eyes, and I saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great." So this ram we see, it's a great ram. It's a ram with 2 horns, and it's pushing throughout all the world. It's pushing north, south, east and west, and it's expanding, and it's getting stronger and stronger. And no one could overpower this ram. This ram did whatever he wanted to do. No one could tell this ram what to do. And as Daniel's seeing this vision, he's watching this ram expanding and pushing. Suddenly another animal appears on the scene, a quicker animal, an animal that's more youthful, an animal that's sprightly, it's vibrant, it's driven. And this animal seems to appear out of nowhere, and it appears rapidly and with great speed. It's a very fast animal. Daniel 8 verse 5. "And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came out from the west on the face of the whole earth, and it touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand." How many of you young people find prophecy difficult? Hands up. How many of you find prophecy difficult? Because I find prophecy quite difficult. Most of your hands are going up. All right. You know, some of the books of the Bible are tough to look at. You know, Zechariah, for example, it's a tough book. Isaiah is a tough book. Daniel is a tough book. I'm sure all of us find it easier to read a couple of Psalms or a couple of nice little sections in the Proverbs or something like that, easier than, say, a portion in Revelation. A character study is a lot easier. My point at the start of the talk is a lot easier than looking at the vials of Revelation, for example, or the beasts, for example. It's understandable. But young people, from God's perspective, I want us to think of this from God's perspective when we think about difficult sections of the Bible that are challenging. From God's perspective, this is offensive to him. It's offensive to God for us to ignore large portions of his letters to us. God would find offence in discounting large chapters of the book that he wrote for us and his message to us, especially to us that are living as we know in these latter days. So it's good as a group that you've come to the book of Daniel, a mix of some of the lighter stuff, but also some of the heavier stuff, the milk and the meat, so to speak. And if there was ever a prophecy that was going to get us excited about the Bible, excited to look at, it's this one. Because this prophecy, quite simply, it explains itself. You may be wondering what these 2 animals represent. In other visions throughout the Bible, this is harder to decipher, but this prophecy tells us exactly who these 2 animals are and exactly what these 2 animals represent. And then it's up to us young people to go away, once we've read the prophecy, to go away and to investigate the history, to actually see if the Bible's true. There's no use believing something just because your parents tell you. And there's no point in you believing something just because I'm standing up here telling you today. You need to prove it to yourself. Make sure that you're convinced. Look at the history and see if the Bible's true. Put it to the test. You know, prophecy is hard. It is hard. It's not unusual to find prophecy hard. Daniel himself, with as high a calibre of spiritual knowledge that he had, he needed somebody to actually explain to him this message as well. So prove it. That's the challenge today, and I bet you're going to be amazed with the accuracy of this prophecy, and hopefully we can come to see that a little bit today together. I want us to come to verse 15 of chapter 8. Verse 15, "It came to pass, when I, even Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand this vision. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. That makes sense, 2 horns. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is its first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand out of the nation, but not in his power. So young people, quite simply, we have 2 kingdoms spoken of here. 2 kingdoms represented, as we said, in 2 animals. A ram representing the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, and an he-goat representing the nation of Greece. So to get back into some of the history, to actually see if the Bible is correct, to put it to the test, we need to go all the way back to the years 359 to 336 BC. And I want to introduce you to a man called Philip II of Macedon. Philip II of Macedon. History, it mainly remembers this guy as being the father of Alexander the Great, but Philip II was an amazing man in his own right. He was driven, he was determined, and he was a leader, just like his son. And Philip II of Macedon began his reign at age 23. Now, a few of you are probably 23 years old, I would imagine. That's a fairly young age to start your reign. And at the time that Philip came to power in Macedonia, Greece itself was a pretty weak and backward sort of country. And Philip set about to transform Macedonia into a formidable military might. And the army of Macedon, the army of Macedonia, became one of the greatest military forces in the ancient world. However, up to this point in time, before Philip II had come to the throne, they'd been regarded as second-rate. However, Philip was able to drill his men. He was able regularly, he ensured unity and ensured cohesion in the ranks of his military. And through demanding excellence from his soldiers in a remarkably short time, that led to the creation of one of the finest military machines that the world had ever seen. Philip was a bit revolutionary when it came to the latest developments in warfare. He deployed the traditional Greek phalanx, which is a division of infantry, and each of the members of the phalanx held a 6-foot-long 2-handed pike. And essentially it formed into a huge porcupine movement that was able to charge and to run at enemies. The Macedonian army under Philip, it perfected coordination of its troop types. They had the heavy infantry phalanx, which I've just said. They've got skirmish infantry. They had archers. They had light cavalry. They had heavy cavalry, and they had siege engines. Revolutionary at the time, and they were all deployed in battle together, coordinated well. Each group used its own advantage to get to the end cause. They were a unified army. And interestingly, from your studies of Daniel 2, this Greek army of King Philip II of Macedon carried bronze shields. Bronze had never been used before. But this Greek army was kitted out with bronze shields. Further proof from Daniel chapter 2. So Philip II, he subdued all the territories around Macedonia and the majority of Greece, and he used force, he used warfare, he used threats, he used bribes, all in order to unify Greece. Greece at the time was in a lot of different sections. There was the Spartans, there was the Athenians, the Thebians, there was lots of different areas in Greece, and it was the work of Philip II, Alexander's father, ultimately at a congress that was held in Corinth, ended up unifying Greece as one country. Philip II, as much as he was a busy man, he did have time to be married 7 times. Unfortunately, he only had the 2 children, and one of those was Alexander. So in 336, Philip II was assassinated. And he was assassinated by his former friend and bodyguard at the age of just 46 years old. Which, with his father now dead, Alexander the Great came to the throne at the age of 21. Now 21 is, I'm sure, lots of you are 21. Now that is even younger to start your rule. And the path was now clear for Alexander to take over from his father, Philip II of Macedon. But after the death of Philip II, a lot of the regions of Greece rose up against Alexander and they challenged his leadership. Often that can occur. And Alexander had to assert his authority at that age of 21. A main revolt came from the area of Thebes. They revolted against Alexander. And Alexander was, as becomes a characteristic that we're going to see more of this afternoon, very, very quickly, he sets about to stamp out this revolt. He marches 480 kilometres in just 2 weeks. And the Thebians were so surprised to see Alexander that they couldn't even believe that it was him coming. He'd marched that far in that short amount of time. He was rapid. Alexander was a man on a mission. He was quick. Such was the speed and the ferocity of the attack that they didn't even think it was him. And it was after he hit this battle of Thebes, that the rest of Greece surrendered and unified under Alexander and elected him as their king. As I said, Alexander was a man in a hurry. He was quick, he was lightning fast. His attacks and the ferocity of his attacks, he came on the enemy without them even thinking, and often catching the enemy completely by surprise. That was his trademark. Alexander was known for his pace, he was known for his drive, his determination, and we'd expect no less from him with the description that was given to us in Daniel chapter 8, verse 5. He's described as a goat whose feet touch not the ground. Such was the speed of Alexander the Great's conquests. And in his sights was the kingdom of Persia. That was his target, that's where he wanted to go. The kingdom that had ruled over his people, the kingdom that had ruled over the world which Alexander really wanted for himself. That was his mission. His eyes were fixed west on Persia, not on Greece. You know, young people, in our lives, hindsight can be a wonderful thing. And especially when thinking of God's providence in our lives. Often at the time of events, things may not make sense. And odd things happen that we sometimes question and we think, well, why did that happen? That was a little bit unusual. But generally, God is in control. He's got a plan. And he's in control of the events of our lives. And he was very much in control of the events of Alexander's life. I want us to think about how hard these angels must have been working, trying to get all these things in place for Alexander to rise to power. They would have been working overtime in order to bring these events to pass of Daniel chapter 8, in line with the vision that God had given Daniel. Because we're at the point in history now that Alexander, he's about to cross the Hellespont, or the Dardanelles. It's an area of water, a section of water today in the Aegean Sea. It's a small gap between Greece and Asia. The Persians on the other side of the sea had amassed an army of about 10 to 20,000 cavalry and about 5 to 20,000 infantry in the town of Zelea. And interestingly, in the Persian army, in their force, there was a Greek mercenary, and his name was Memnon, called Memnon of Rhodes. And he was a consultant to the Persian army, a bit of a mercenary. And Memnon was a pretty smart guy. He knew how to defeat Greece. He had some good ideas, obviously. He was Greek, he was a smart man. And he advised the Persians that the best way to hinder and overthrow Alexander would have been to retreat and then burn and destroy all the crops in the land. Now his theory was to destroy all the land and make it waste, and he called this theory, it's called the scorched earth theory. Now essentially, to make the land waste and to make Alexander and his army starve for not having any food. They'd become weak with the journey and the marching in the distance and eventually have to turn back. So it was a good theory. It made perfect sense. And it was likely the correct theory. However, the Persian leaders didn't trust Memnon in this case. They were concerned about his Greek heritage, and they didn't think that at this point his advice was sound. And also they were too proud to torch their own ground. They were not going to do that and refused. So they came up with this other tactic. There were two objectives. First, they would try to force Alexander to a position of choosing before he could continue inland. And second, the Persian hoped to be able to be in a defensive position that would minimise Alexander's advantage in battle and their infantry. So the Persians advanced from Zelea to this river called the Granicus River, and they set up in position there. The Persians chose a river. Remember what we said, we're going to try to prove the Bible. They chose a river. So if the Persian commander had heeded the words of Memnon, the sound advice of Memnon, there would be no river. If the Persian commanders had heeded the warning to fall back, burn the crops, there would be no river. If the Persians were listening to the sound advice of Memnon, there would be no river at all. As I said, those angels were working hard, young people. Overtime was going into setting this up. Fair moving of the chess pieces by God's messengers, the angels. And God tells us words today to keep us, God tells us words to keep in mind today and in coming days for us. He says in Isaiah 46 verse 9, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God. There is none else. I am God, and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient time the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do my pleasure." God simply, in a vision to Daniel, said that a ram and an he-goat would both stand at a river. And he simply tells us in verse 4 that the ram or Persia would become great. Persia would push throughout the whole world. It would be so great that no one could stand in their way until a he-goat, or the Greeks, came from the west at rapid speed and pace, with huge determination, with a notable single horn as a leader at the helm in Alexander the Great. And he'd charge at the ram in fury in verse 6 at a river.
The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire. Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold, and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing he posted Thessalian, Greek and Thracian cavalry under Parmenian's command. In the centre were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager and Crateros. On the right, Alexander himself with the companion cavalry under Philotas, as well as the elite hypaspists, the Agrianes javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses, and men against men. the Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank, the Persians determined to prevent them crossing and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then, suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles. Roesaces rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Mithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred.
I was asked to cover the 3 major battles of Alexander. I thought instead of me just droning on up here, I'll show you 3 videos. Hopefully it keeps you awake, for one. But he should have listened to the Greek guy. They should have listened to the Greek guy and retreated, burned the fields, and would have saved their army. But you know what, young people? God's message and God's prophecy was not for this to occur. God's message is clear, the prophecy is clear, it's accurate, it's definitive. And for some of you that are sitting here today, perhaps questioning whether the Bible is real or whether this is even all worth it, hopefully this is some of the proof that God's word is true and it's accurate. We've seen it in Daniel chapter 8, and we've looked at history, and we can see it starting to come to pass. But the detail, from the direction to the pace, to the single horn, the single leader, to the location, all accurate to the T. And it gives us great confidence in our God and in his message and in his plan for us also. So from the Battle of Granicus, or the Granicus River, the Greeks continued to make inroads into the Persian territory. And if we read in Daniel 8 verse 7, we see some very interesting language that is used. In Daniel 8:7, "And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him. And he smote the ram and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand." Now the words here, "moved with choler," I had to look it up because I didn't know what it meant either. The word choler means to be furious, vexed, sorely grieved, bitter. And there seems to be a bit of a distinct change in the motive behind Alexander's mission, a mission which was based initially on Greek might and rule and pride, to a mission now that was one that was fueled out of hate, anger and bitterness. Between the Battle of Granicus and the second major battle, the Battle of Issus, that we're going to look at shortly, there was an incident that was very brutal. It was hurtful to Alexander, and it really changed the game for him, because Alexander had chosen to leave a lot of his wounded from the Battle of Granicus in a town of Issus. And he believed this city to be safe while he went off in search of Darius and the rest of the Persian army. So he left them in the town of Issus. Well, Darius managed to come to Issus. Alexander didn't find him, and Darius proceeded to slay and brutally torture and kill all the Greek wounded that were left in that city. Being moved with bitterness, anger, being absolutely furious, Alexander marched onto the city of Issus.
18 months had passed since Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire. Now Alexander led his men into Cilicia and was soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself, emerged behind the Greek army to the north. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2 to 1. So he blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide, from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong, and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals. His best cavalry were massed on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center. Persian infantry formed his left wing. Alexander deployed his own army for battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes, his elite Agriane javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the Hypaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinarus, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking out some by name. Then, at the head of his army's right wing, he charged. Once again, the speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries threatened on their flank were soon in disarray, and the Macedonian phalanx was able to resume its advance. Alexander fought his way towards the great king Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry. If the Persians could break through here, they could envelop Alexander's army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his troops fought doggedly and continued to hold the Persians at bay. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves.
You know, this Battle of Issus was no doubt a miracle. No doubt about it. Purely unnatural victory that Alexander was able to make happen. Much like some of the modern battles that Israel has been faced with in their recent history. Alexander, as we saw, was outnumbered 2-1. And yet Alexander, in his fierce determination, his speed, which we saw and was reiterated in that video, the speed and the might and the surprise managed to overthrow the Persians at Issus. Darius flees the battle, as we just saw, and the Persians are in retreat. And in this battle, Alexander manages to take captive Darius's wife, his mother, and his children. And he actually treats them quite well, and he spares their life, and he takes them into his own family. Alexander then travels down the coast of the Mediterranean, onwards in his conquest. He takes Sidon and he takes Tyre. And if you've got some time in this coming week or whenever, have a look at this Battle of Tyre, when he builds the causeway prophesied in the book of Ecclesial. He builds a causeway across the city, and it takes him 7 months to overthrow Tyre. And then he marches on to Jerusalem. I wasn't going to cover this much, but I had to because it's quite remarkable when he comes to Jerusalem. He marched on Jerusalem with every intention of overthrowing Jerusalem as well. And the high priest in Jerusalem hears that Alexander was coming, and he goes out to meet Alexander to try to broker peace and hopes to avoid war. And the amazing part for us is that Alexander, when he sees this high priest, he kneels down and he worships the high priest. And you may think, well, what's all that about? That's a bit unusual. Yes, it is. It's completely unusual. Before Alexander left on his conquest, before he left Greece, apparently he had this vision, and he saw this high priest in the vision. And the high priest told him that he would one day conquer the whole of Persia. And so when he sees this high priest coming out of the city of Jerusalem, he kneels down in front of him and he worships, and he spares the city and is actually taken in and looked after at the city. That's amazing. That's another proof of God's amazing prophecy. More interesting than that is when he comes into the city. Now, this is a little bit in dispute, but the historian Josephus actually says this. He says this, the following. He says, when the book of Daniel was showed to him, as in Alexander, when the book of Daniel was showed to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the army of the Persians, Alexander supposed that himself was the person intended, and then he was glad. Now, we don't know if that's for certain, but that's what the historian Josephus writes. So our God is amazing, young people. And I hope you're starting to see this, some of the accuracy of the detail and the way that Jerusalem was spared. This wasn't the time for Jerusalem to be destroyed. And Alexander then proceeds all the way down into Egypt, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrenders to him. He takes Egypt. He goes up to Alexandria, renames the city in his own honour, goes down to Memphis. He's crowned Pharaoh in Memphis. And then he travels back to Tyre. And it was in Tyre that Alexander receives the letter from Darius. Darius offers him his daughter. He offers him a fortune in gold, and he offers him half of his kingdom in exchange for peace. Now, what we've started to learn is Alexander wasn't the sort of guy to negotiate. And so he promptly turns down the offer from Darius, and he heads into another battle.
Having subdued Persian lands west of the Euphrates River, he now headed east into the empire's heartlands, seeking a final showdown with the Persian king, Darius III. Receiving news that a great Persian army led by Darius had assembled at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq, he made straight for it. This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander, and Alexander's chance to smash Persian power once and for all. Darius had chosen to fight on open ground, where his advantage in numbers would be more telling. His soldiers had also worked hard to clear and flatten the terrain, to make it suitable for Persian war chariots. By modern estimates, the Persian army was between 50 and 80,000 strong, and made up of contingents from across the empire. Infantry from Syria and Babylonia, cavalry from Armenia, India and Central Asia, up to 200 scythed chariots, even a handful of war elephants. Alexander's army was smaller and may have been outnumbered by as much as 2 to 1. He deployed his units in their usual formation. On the left flank, Thracian and Thessalian cavalry, commanded by Parmenion. In the centre, the Macedonian veterans of the phalanx, each armed with their 18-foot sarissa pike. On the right flank, Alexander with his elite cavalry, the companions, and his best infantry, the hypaspists. These were the units with which Alexander planned to launch his main attack. Greek hoplites formed a second line and supported both wings, which were angled back to guard against encirclement by the Persians. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. Could Alexander really be trying to encircle their huge army? The Persians mirrored his movement, taking troops away from their center to outflank Alexander and prevent him leaving the area they'd cleared for the Persian chariots. But Alexander's unusual maneuver was a trap to entice the Persians to weaken their center. When he saw that it had worked, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge, to keep the Persians fixed in position. A giant cavalry battle developed on the right wing. Darius, meanwhile, judging this to be the decisive moment, unleashed his chariots. Expert Agrianes javelin throwers took out horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now Alexander led his companion cavalry and parts of the Macedonian phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian center, fighting his way towards Darius himself. The sudden ferocity of Alexander's assault threw the Persians into panic. The center of the army broke and ran, King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion, facing a huge onslaught by Persian cavalry, was virtually surrounded. Indian and Scythian horsemen had even ridden through a gap in the Greek line. But rather than wheeling and attacking the Greeks from behind, they'd carried straight on to loot their camp. Parmenion sent a desperate appeal to Alexander for help. The king abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing. It was the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle, claiming the lives of 60 of Alexander's companions. Finally, as news of Darius' flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory for Alexander. According to ancient sources, he lost just a few hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands.
It's probably a good point for us just to stop and to see what we've seen so far. It's very easy for us to watch these movies. It's very easy for us to read the history and see the detail that is given for us and think, well, yes, Greece overthrew Persia. The Bible said it would happen. Okay, it happened. But we need to stop and think how privileged that we all are sitting here today. We've seen the history that's been fulfilled, and we've seen from history that the events of Daniel chapter 8 have come to pass. That is astonishing. It is absolutely unbelievable. And the advantage that we have over that of Daniel is that we've actually been able to see these events unfold. We haven't just seen the vision, but we've seen the detail and we've seen the historical detail of this vision being fulfilled. So it's good for us to pause and just consider how privileged that we are as a people. We truly are very privileged to see this in its fulfillment. Well, Alexander, he continues west. Running out of time, he continues west. He pursues Darius, and Darius is assassinated by one of his own men in Bessus. And after this, he heads further west, having killed Darius, and he ultimately comes to India. Such a huge achievement for a man at 32 years of age. In 13 short years, Alexander had amassed the largest empire that the world had ever seen, from Greece all the way to India. His speed and his ferocity were never before seen. At just 32 years of age, at the peak of his physical power, at the top of his game, the leader of the Grecian army, the leader of the world. 32, king of the world. At 32 years of age, Alexander the Great was struck down dead in the city of Babylon. He suffered 12 days of excruciating suffering, and he ultimately succumbed. It's a very unusual death, and no one really knows how or why Alexander died. Why at the peak of Alexander's power, why at the peak of his power was this man's life brought to an end? One of the most recognisable personalities that the world has ever seen, cut down in his prime. Why? Daniel 8 verse 8. Therefore the great horn, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Quite simply, young people, this was God's plan. This was set in order, it was meticulously organised, it was prophesied, sealed and delivered to Daniel in a vision. For Daniel, this would have not been a surprise had he been alive and seen this occur. And how great is our God, the accuracy of this prophecy. I'm sure you all had it covered in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living must know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will, setting up over it the basest of men, that the living may know. That's me and you. That's not Daniel, that's not Abraham, that's not David, Esther, any of the greats of the Bible. That's us, that's each one of us here today, the living, that the living may know. That each one of us here today can look at this vision, that we can compare this vision to the historical record, and we can see that our God is in control. To sit here this afternoon and to be amazed at the history that our God was able to organise in 13 short years the whole world affairs. That in 13 years, our God was able to usher in a whole new world power. In 13 years, God was able to raise into power a man called Alexander. This man would head west, hunt and destroy the greatest power at the time to date, and usher in a new world dynasty. And all of us here this afternoon, we sit here in a world of frustration and fear. We sit here in a world of uncertainty, of trouble, hurt and anxiety. And in the last 18 months, our God has turned our world upside down. Our world's been turned upside down in the biggest way since World War II, young people. We've seen world events that Daniel would have loved to see. But through all of this, we sit here this afternoon and we know that our God rules in the kingdom of men. We sit here in full confidence and peace, knowing that our God is in control. That's comforting. That through the uncertainties of life, no matter what we go through, no matter our personal struggles, our situations, the same God that rearranged world events in 13 short years in Alexander's time is the same God who has turned the world upside down in the times of Alexander, and is the same God in the book of Isaiah who says he has graven us into the very palms of his hands. You know, Alexander the Great, young people, was cut down in his prime, at the very peak of his individual powers. And there's a very relevant lesson for each of us sitting here this afternoon. See, most of you are setting out on your life journey. For some of you, you're completing your final years at school, and thoughts no doubt are turning to your ideal career. For some of you, you are here in tertiary education, learning and studying for your chosen field of employment. For some of you here today, you are in your first job and you're embracing the challenges and the enjoyments that this brings. I've no doubt that some of you are brilliant. Some of you are clever. Some of you will become entrepreneurs. You'll become lead in your industries. You'll become leaders in your field. Some of you may even discover something that no one has ever discovered before. Some of you will become very wealthy. Some of you perhaps will become a large employer of people. Just like Alexander, so too are each of you on your own journey. You're discovering your own journey of discovery. You're discovering who you are. You're discovering your interests. You're discovering your pursuits. You're discovering new freedoms. You are possibly experimenting. I have no doubt I've been there too. And just like Alexander chose to push the boundaries of his kingdom, so too you are at times also pushing the boundaries of your kingdom, or the boundaries of your parents perhaps, or pushing the boundaries of society perhaps. You're on a journey of exploration. As humans, this is what we naturally want to do. Make wise choices, young people. In your journey of exploration and your journey of discovery, in your young years, make sound and wise choices. For Alexander the Great, I'm sure he had a vision of where he was going, of arriving back into his native Macedonia, victorious, a hero, to live out his life as a god in Greece. And this was all torn away from him at the age of 32. As a community, we have lost young people your age. It is sad, it's extremely sad, but we are not immune to these things. I suppose my simple message to you today from the life of Alexander is those famous words of Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. The New Living Translation says, don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Sure, pursue excellence, become leaders, but do it like a Daniel, who from a slave rose to greatness without losing sight of where he came from or what his priorities really were. Do it like a Daniel. Be a 24-hour follower of God and make wise choices. Because just like Alexander, we don't know when our time is up. So back to the history. Alexander dies without leaving a clear heir, and so the empire of Greece is oddly divided among his four generals. 4 generals take control, which is really strange. It's odd. And there's not one ruler that replaced him, but 4. And it doesn't really work having 4 captains on a football team, or joint captains on a football team, let alone in a nation. And this is what happened. The 4 rulers of this empire, they argued amongst themselves, they fought, they didn't get on, and they spent a lot of time fighting against each other. And the constant fighting caused the empire to weaken culturally and militarily, ultimately falling to the might of Rome. Why though 4 generals? Daniel 8 verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. If we read on the explanation of the vision, further details are given in verse 21. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. On the screen, we've got the four regions or the nations that sort of came from Alexander's death. Four would stand in the place of one, but not in the same power. And that is straight from Daniel, and it's backed up by history. It's really quite remarkable, and for me this gives me a huge amount of confidence in our Bible that we know it to be true. That to the letter, history has proved the vision that God gave Daniel. Well, as we know, Rome ended up historically overthrowing the nation of Greece, and from your consideration of Daniel 2, you'd know that the iron of Rome continues down to the feet of iron and clay, which is the stone power that Christ is ultimately going to war against. This Roman power of verse 23 as a king of fierce countenance is described in verse 23 as a king of fierce countenance. This Roman thinking, young people, has continued for all time. This Roman influence, as we have said, extends the period of our time today, the feet of iron and clay, this system of Roman religion. The Catholic Church setting itself up as the mother of all churches, a system and a religion that God hates, a system to which we need to be wary and conscious of. This system has stood the test of time and has continued influencing, brutalising, destroying, lying and manipulating, and will ultimately be combined with the might of the Russian army to wage war on God's people. Daniel 8 verse 25, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. I think for us here today, there's a lesson, young people, in the way that the Grecian Empire was overthrown. I began our talk this afternoon by commenting on the view that I have standing up here in front of you all here. And it's a great privilege, because I look out and I can see the future of our empire. It's a great privilege, the future of our Christadelphian empire, the future of God's people, God's empire. And each one of you are conquerors. Each one of you are leaders. Each one of you here today has the power to influence those around you for good or bad. Your friends, your families, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, each of you have been handed the keys to God's empire. Each of you has been called to preserve God's empire. You all have a responsibility to preserve God's heritage. You are custodians of his hope. You are his future. And we live today in a very divided world. Social media has had a part to play in this, where opinions are divided and divisions are broadened on political and social lines. And as a community, young people, we're not immune to division. See, the reason the Grecian Empire was overthrown was a lack of strong leadership and infighting for power and authority. An old World War II saying for America was, "United we stand, divided we fall." How true this is for us today. That division and disunity ultimately cost the Grecian Empire its power, and this is not a new concept. Paul cautioned the Corinthians of this when he said in 1 Corinthians 11 that he suspected that there was divisions among them, and he partly believed it. In order for us to preserve the heritage of God, for you all here to be leaders, conquerors, defenders of God's empire, we need to remain united. We all need to stand together and not allow infighting and struggles for power to divide us. See, when the Empire of Greece was under the rulership of one man, the empire was strong, it was fearless. The Empire of Greece was united. Alexander himself actually sensed that one day the Romans would end up overtaking his empire, and he said a very interesting thing relevant to our last point. He said a very famous statement when referencing Rome. He said, "I'm not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I'm afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. And as a community, young people, we don't have rulers among us. We don't have kings. We don't have priests. We don't have bishops or generals. We have one leader, and that one leader is Christ. We have one shepherd, Christ, and we are his sheep, and he is our lion. Revelation 5 verse 5, one of the elders said unto me, Weep no more, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered. We are at our strongest when we are united together under our leader Christ. We are not an army of lions led by a sheep. We are a group of sheep that are led by a lion. So what of our lion leader? What of the future king of the world? You know, this year you've been considering the theme of the tale of two kingdoms, the kingdom of men versus the kingdom of God. And today we've paused to consider the kingdom of Greece and that of Alexander the Great. A mighty man, a man full of pride, a man full of self-confidence, a man whose mission was to conquer the world, a man who tamed a black horse which no one else could, called Bucephalus, a man whose sole aim was to conquer the world, a man who wanted to make of himself a name and to be remembered, a man who was born to royalty, a man who was trained by one of the greatest minds ever in the history of mankind in Aristotle, a man who achieved greatness for a period, a man whose life was cut short prematurely at just 32 years of age. And we think of our leader, our lion leader, our shepherd of the kingdom of God, a humble man, a carpenter, a man who had no formal education, a man who was born to an unmarried woman, a man whose sole mission was to conquer himself, a man who Zechariah said rode a donkey. Zechariah 9, Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation. He's lowly and he's riding on an ass. A man who came to build a family, of which you and me are part. And a man who at 33 years of age, his life was also cut short. A man that has achieved greatness for eternity. This, young people, is the tale of two kingdoms. And we sit here today as God's future, and the choices are ours. On whose side do we choose? Are we an army of lions that are going to be led by a sheep? Or are we an army of sheep that are going to be led by a lion? Don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Make wise choices.
Thank you very much for that, Brad. There's so much to learn, and what I took away is, well, one of the points I took away is that it doesn't matter what happens, God is always in control. Now, we are going to sing a song, Precious Promises, but because we've never sung it at Hebron or Suburban before, Liv will play through a verse and a chorus, and then once she's played through that, if everyone can stand up and keep your mask on, then we'll sing. And then after that, Steve Kiddo will come up and say a prayer for the talk and for dinner. So, thanks, Liv.
Let's pray. Dear Lord and Father of all, thou who knowest the end from the beginning, thou who art so powerful and mighty, hallowed be thy great and thy glorious name. We are so thankful for the privilege we have to come unto thee in prayer, and we thank thee for the chance to come and build our relationship with thee, to listen to thy word being expounded unto us. We have seen thy servant Daniel, thy servant who is constantly in communication with thee, serving thee to the best of his ability. Be with us as we turn to thee throughout the day. Help us to pray together and encourage each other to become more like Daniel and more like Christ. We have been shown thy might and the extent of thy knowledge, as thou hast prophesied exactly what would happen years before the event, proving to us that thy word is true, something we can trust, and proves to us that every promise thou hast made will come to pass. We look forward to thy promises coming to pass, when thy Son will return to the earth to set up thy glorious kingdom. We also thank thee for the food thou hast provided for us. We realize that it comes from thee, as do every single one of our blessings. We pray that we may use the strength gained from the food to continue to listen to thy word and to want to learn from it, to also look for ways to serve others and treat each other as we would thy Son. We pray that thou will continue to keep us safe, and we leave the rest of this night in thy care. Through thy Son, Jesus Christ, we come unto thee now. Amen.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the August Double Study Day. As Brad said, it's really exciting to see you here, and it's great to see so many of us in the one place. Thanks, Brad, very much for your study. It was really engaging and really interesting, with lots of lessons for us to take, so thank you. Thanks also to Jesse, Sam, Liv and Steve. Now, I've just got a few brief announcements, and regarding dinner, we've got chicken and chips with cans and ice cream. So when dinner is ready, please line up on this aisle down the side here. Make your way through the first set of doors to collect your food, which will be served to you, and that everyone serving will give everything that you need. So please don't touch anything if possible, apart from what people are giving you. And then make your way from the last set of doors back out into this main hall and find a seat. We need to have you all seated while you are eating food. The cost for dinner is $10, and you can pay by cash, card or bank transfer. You'll just need to see James Evans on the way through this first set of doors to pay for dinner. Now, please don't leave the hall between study 1 and study 2, but if you do need to leave, just go and speak to one of the hosts and let them know that you need to leave. And as annoying as masks are, please make sure you wear them apart from when you're trying to eat your dinner, because that gets messy. Study 2 will be at 7:30 p.m, and Uncle Tim Badger is going to speak to the theme, We Have Sinned, based on Daniel chapter 9. Thanks very much, Steve, for saying thanks for dinner. I hope you'll enjoy chicken and chips.